Okay, so as we're continuing to learn about this client who's experienced a history of domestic violence and kind of see how family systems approaches can be applicable to helping clients like this, it's also important to see what theories um, kind of help as we look at family violence and domestic violence and what theories can be applied to these issues in terms of trying to comprehend where these families are coming from, what their experiences really mean, what contributes to domestic violence, what is domestic violence, what isn't domestic violence. So in some of the research that I had done, there's quite a lot of theories that contribute, their voice to the definition or explanation of family violence and domestic violence issues. Some theorists will look at family violence in a sociological perspective and and really look and seek to explain what violent behavior is. And it's determined from a sociological perspective that that violent behavior is not just this individual behavior that one person decides to take on because they're deviant or they're a bad person or they're a criminal. Um, it is not something that should be looked at on an individual level per se at all. In fact, sociological perspective has us looking at it as a social structure. So violence, especially family violence, is something that is possibly learned, most likely learned, where somebody who is abusive or somebody who's, the person that is receiving that abuse is experiencing what they have observed over time. They have possibly learned this to be what is normal. So rather than unhealthy or healthy interactions, this is just normal to them. They're not identifying it as healthy or unhealthy. They're identifying it as what has been acceptable as they've been growing up their entire lives. Um, so looking at it in that way, we can kind of helps us understand as therapists where these clients are coming from. Um, it could be really easy to say, hey, I would or would not do that, but this is what is normal. This is what has been learned by this client in this family. This is how that client and family have functioned over time. So, as we're talking about systems and functioning systems and all these parts, that have all these roles and play um, in all these different ways in terms of contributing to healthy or unhealthy functioning, um, what we want to do is look at what they might have been experiencing that have led them to this way of functioning. And for them, this is healthy. For them, there's nothing that maybe not healthy, but this is what's working. How about that? This is what helped their uh, their system work. And right now, with the abuser in their role and the identified victim who will hopefully become that survivor of domestic violence, that person has their role, the children have their role, and that is what works for that system. And so looking at it that way helps, and then also kind of leads us to other family violence theories. So that systems theory, which we've been kind of addressing as a family system, um, that that these behaviors again are learned. They're learned as being functional. It's what helps different people interact in their own way, express themselves in their own way, what they know to be the best or most effective way of expressing emotions, whether or not it's healthy to us. That's what works for them. Um, so those kinds of family violence theories contribute to that, showing or emphasizing that domestic violence is an expression of conflict within the family that contributes to violence and the use of violence. So again, one person or these family members are not violent people necessarily, but they are using violence as an effective way for them to express whatever conflict or emotions that they're feeling, because as those sociological theorists kind of think, that's what was observed, that's what was learned, that's what's socially acceptable, and it has been socially acceptable, and that's also what's acceptable maybe within their culture, which we will talk about. We'll talk about culture a little bit later. Then there is the feminist theory, and we've talked about feminist theory or learned about feminist theory a little bit in the meta frameworks chapters, what feminist theory means and how that contributes to the actions and behaviors of families and people in their families. The feminist theory does view DV or domestic violence as an expression of gender-based domination, for men to kind of control women. And since we're talking about a feminist theory approach, it makes sense that we would be looking at it that way, that it is an expression of domination so that men can control women. And when we talk about and define domestic violence, it is a way for one person to control another person. A lot of times people believe some of the myths we hear that domestic violence is a loss of control, or domestic violence is always has to do with physical aggression, and it doesn't. This idea of domestic violence as an expression of domination is relevant. It's one person doing anything they can to control the other. That could be physically, that could be emotionally, verbally, financially, through the children. It actually does not have to involve physical violence at all to be considered domestic violence. As I'm working with different families, or different clients and helping their families, this idea of men dominating women is not necessarily relevant in all families, as there are men who come in, with experiences of being abused emotionally and physically, a lot of times more verbally and emotionally by women. We also There also is the idea that there can be same-sex partners where abuse and domestic violence is exhibited and does take place. And so this kind of thinking about that helps to kind of put into context what domestic violence and what family violence really is. So again, different people look at it different ways, but it can be a learned behavior, it can be a expression of conflict, it can be an expression of control and domination, and it could be all three of those things or many more all at once. But taking into consideration these different theories really helps therapists to see what is domestic violence, because it can be easy to have a client walk in and to us that is not a situation we would want to be in, but to them this is what is normal, this is what has worked, and now up until now it has worked, and now it's not working anymore, and they want to find a way to change it. Okay, so as we learn about these different theories and we take back into consideration the family systems theories and the approaches that kind of encompass those theories, the work with client was very much incorporating family systems theories, and whether or not we're working on an individual level or a family level, it is possible to implement some of those approaches to help client really see where they came from, what's contributed to their thoughts and beliefs and values on a family systems and level and in that context. So by working with client was able to really assess her own history of domestic violence, her history of different relationships, and also assess the level of violence in history between her parents. Not just parents, her aunts and uncles, her grandparents. She was able to determine what looked healthy to her at first, and then now looking back, now that she knows a little bit more about different things, what maybe wasn't so healthy. When she first started seeing abusive experiences as a child with her own parents, and when her own patterns of abusive relationships started to exist, which she later was able to identify that she maybe has never had an experience in a healthy relationship that has been healthy from start to finish, especially because her partnership with her husband was for over 20 years. After being able to identify this on an individual level, she was able to observe how her interactions, her parents' interactions, her interactions with her husband, how that really played a part in the aggression that was developing with her children, specifically her oldest child, who was an adult, and starting his own adult relationships. She was able to observe her own interactions with her children that were forming over time and how that kind of contributed to this buildup of aggression. And she started considering, the impact that the dynamic of her parents' relationship had on her, and then what the impact of her own relationship with her husband, the impact that that had on her children, and what relationships will look like for her children. And once she started getting to those realizations, she wanted more than anything to continue the progress she was making, and she realized just how important it is to really see what her role is and to make some of those changes and to work with her family to make those changes as well. After assessing this history and her individual history, her family history, and the potential future that her family could have, she used these patterns to figure out what was she able to change and what she was not able to change. What are some changes that need to be made? What did not need to be made? What was healthy for her? What was unhealthy for her and her family? And she defined her own healthiness and unhealthiness, and she was able to then use that to recreate goals, to reestablish them and maintain her treatment plan. And that was really important for her to kind of figure out on her own. This is what works for me. This is what doesn't work for me, and she was able to do that. So, in order to start kind of facilitating in that change process, she focused on herself first. We talked a lot about the self versus the system, and she worked on her individual self first. She realized that in order for her to make changes with her family system on the family level, she needed to increase her own healthiness, build up her own self-esteem levels, implement healthy coping skills and communication skills so that she could be an effective part of that bigger family system. Her hope was not just to work with her own children in a healthy way. Her hope was also to be able to create, and establish healthy relationships with her friends, healthy relationships with future partners, and healthy relationships with her parents. Because up until counseling, those relationships kind of had patterns of being really strong and then not being very strong. And so she wanted to kind of make her parents aware of the patterns and the interactions that they had and how that impacted her and how she then impacted her children. So that was important to her. Another application of family systems was client identifying her own role within the family system and realizing how much she really had of an ability to influence everyone else in her system. And throughout the treatment process, her role continuously changed. When she first came in, she felt as though she was the caregiver to her children. She took care of her children. She cooked. She cleaned. That was her role. Her role was to be quiet, to take the demands and to do what she was told. She did not have a sense of independence. She did not finish school. She did not work. Her role was to be there for her children and her husband the way that her husband asked her to or told her to. Over time, her role changed when she decided to separate from her partner, her husband, and he actually left the home and changed the dynamic of the family system. She took on a different role. Her role became, provider and caregiver. She was needing to then keep the family together and figure out how to make the family work and how to help each of the family members figure out what their roles are and how they can work now as this new different structure of a family without the father figure in that system. And so as she maintained and continued through treatment, her role consistently changed. Um, as she was able to kind of do a lot of this during her group and family sessions, figuring out how to use her new skills and make other observations in comparison to her group members and her family and her other family members, and how they use their skills and their knowledge that she kind of imparted on to them. It was very helpful for her in group because she was able to really see how um, how the dynamics of DV really play um, into the family system, how domestic violence and violent interactions can go from one generation to another and be learned from one person to the next. And she was able to learn that from other group members who had very similar and very different experiences than her. At first, she thought, maybe she was alone in this, but this is actually, a cycle and a pattern that occurs, and this helped her in motivating her to make changes. And then using those skills and making those observations in the family setting when it did occur was very helpful for her to see how the changes in the family system were impacting her children, how they were using their coping skills and communication skills to deal with those changes, and being able to kind of measure progress that way was also something that she was able to do through those different counseling services that she participated in. Luckily for her, the majority of her family was supportive to make some of these decisions. We talked about being ready and assessing for readiness. Client was definitely ready. She determined she was ready at a certain point, and she was afraid that the rest of her family would not be, especially her parents that later were the ones that helped her become, financially more stable and helped her with her housing situation, which she was surprised at how much support she got from her parents because that relationship was unstable before. She also was able to kind of engage her children and see where they were at and their readiness to change. She was afraid of the idea that the decision to separate from their dad would weaken the relationship with her children. And for the most part, her children were very supportive and actually made statements within sessions that whatever makes her happy, they will support as long as she's not being hurt anymore and as long as they are able to stay together and work together as a family. For the most part, her children did participate in family sessions when she needed them to. However, her oldest child did not always participate and was not always present in those few sessions that were had. And client feels as though that might be because he did have the most time in the family system with mom and dad, experiencing the dynamics and interactions that he had. To him, that was normal. And at 19, 20 years old, when that changes, that's a little bit harder to do than the younger children who were 11 and 13. So she did observe that and worked the hardest to help him outside of those sessions. She brought resources, and eventually that child ended up, or adult child ended up receiving his own counseling services, and over time the entire family unit was able to kind of grow together and develop together. So that was pretty neat to see. As we're continuing to learn about the client and other domestic violence victims, survivors, it's important to see how family systems theory, since we're really connecting family systems theory to domestic violence, what those implications mean for a client who's experienced domestic violence. And so some of these next things that we'll be discussing really help us to put more ideas into perspective and to see where clients might be and why and how they've experienced certain things. So these are really important to figure out how to understand and how to apply or assess clients in these different ways. So the idea that there are influences between the different levels of the family, so the subsystems, your grandparents, parents, parents to children, sibling to sibling, how each of those contribute to the capacity of a couple to be intimate and to function in a healthy way, or what people would identify as healthy for the most part. So that means that there is this idea that what how parents interact with each other, that impacts and influences how children might interact with each other, and how parents might interact with their children, and then how what capacity those children might have to engage and interact in a healthy, intimate partner relationship, or maybe they don't have the capacity to do so at all. Basically, whatever a child, this has to do with the implication that whatever a child is experiencing, from or observing from their own parents or other family members, has the ability to very much contribute to their own interactions and their own relationships. And the client I've been speaking of was able to attest to that. Although she wasn't as aware of it when she started, she realized just how much her own parents' engagement with each other impacted her ability to communicate and express anger and all of those different things. And she also looked at her partner and determined that his influences in his relationships with his family members also, there must have been something that was not as functional as they thought, because he learned to behave and interact in a certain way, and both of them took that to their intimate partner relationship. And again, so the influences between the different levels, it affects the capacity to do so, to have that healthy or have a relationship at all with another person in an intimate way. That being said, aggressive behavior that was learned or observed or implemented in adolescence, that can be a predictor of relationship violence or domestic violence as children enter adulthood. And this is definitely seen in this case example. So far, client has identified that she did not have the healthiest ways to express herself, and also was noticing an aggression that was built up over time, that was learned as early adolescence, behavior that she learned now has realized she learned from her parents. And then her concern was the aggression and violence that was being displayed by her and her husband. She was concerned that her own children were also learning that and mimicking it and modeling, and she was modeling that to them, and her partner was modeling that to them. And it wasn't until she saw that in her adult child that she realized maybe it is possible to make a difference if she had the ability to shape them in certain ways, or if her abusive parents had the ability to shape her and her dynamics, and she and her partner had the ability to she and her partner also had the ability to kind of model unhealthy behaviors to her children. So again, that being said, if aggressive behavior can be learned and be a predictor of the relationships in adulthood, so can positive, healthy, loving behavior. And so this idea that when we take into consideration family systems theory, healthy interactions, the ability to enter a loving and connected relationship, that is best predicted by early family functioning. So what is learned as in early childhood, adolescence, and then into adulthood, that has the ability, whether it's negative or positive, to carry into those different stages. And the client recognized that and wanted to go ahead and prevent all of her children from repeating the same cycle of violence, into their adulthood. And by recognizing that, she was able to kind of shift the dynamics of her relationships with her children. Unfortunately, she felt that the best way to minimize that aggressive behavior, that violent behavior, was to separate permanently from her partner. Does not mean that her children could not have relationships with their father, but the relationship she had with her husband was not healthy to her. She identified it was not healthy to her. It was not something that she wanted her children to continue observing that unhealthy and abusive relationship. So for her, separating was the best way to model love and healthy connections to her children. That way she can demonstrate what love and healthy interactions look like, and they could then, hopefully build their own healthy relationships with their father, and in the future have their own healthy relationships with future partners. Being able to understand and track the cycles of the interactions that have been had can be helpful in people who've experienced domestic violence in identifying those underlying emotions, that their behaviors are typically expressing. A client was able to really go back and look at the different interactions that she had with her partner. And although the partner was not a part of her counseling, and later was not part of the family system, she was able to assess the different interactions that he initiated, the different interactions that she was a part of, and how a lot of that aggression and that violence was most likely, their way of expressing emotions that they couldn't communicate themselves. And as she was learning all this, she realized that in order for her partner to change as well, or to make changes, that he would have to realize this for himself, and he would have to want to be able to change and want to be able to understand where his emotions are coming from and how he expresses them, and whether or not that is a healthy or unhealthy way to express them. So being able to track these patterns and these different cycles that occur, that really helps people in general to figure out what are these emotions that I'm feeling, and how are my behaviors an expression of that emotion. She was able to see, every time I say this or do this, I really am feeling this way, and so that was helpful for a client. And so in regards to these ideas, research really kind of contributes to this idea that the patterns and cycles of violence, the idea that violence can be intergenerational, this idea that what happens in one level of the family can then be passed on to the next level of the family. Given all of this research and this data, it can be said that family systems approaches are possibly more effective than the interventions that are done on an individual level. While an individual may be ready to change and ready to identify their goals and make progress toward their goals, if the family is not ready, then those changes are not going to be sustainable. Luckily, fortunately for client, her family also saw the importance of making changes. Her children ultimately ended up being very supportive of her, and surprisingly for client, her parents also were supportive of her too. Though initially to them, she should have stayed married, she should have done anything she could to remain in this relationship, they ultimately were able to see the positive effect that some of these different some of this implementation of these new skills and these new ideas, how that had a better effect. And so really looking at the individual in the context of the family, and bringing in the family as best as possible, or at least figuring out how to have a client implement these changes on the family level, that has been said to be more effective than that individual intervention only.